a path she could take. One which she could choose. She could see her friends and family again. Cecilia turned sharply and descended down. This time her rate of fall slowed dramatically and she saw the confines of the memory cloud into which she was descending. Before her, a wizard. He was unmistakably so. And, unmistakably, she was at Grimmauld Place. She watched as the wizard looked to his right to the doorway which, Cecilia knew, led into the living room of the house. He seemed to be nursing something in his hands as he sat on a chair close to the door and looked between it and the door. As she drew closer, she realized the wizard was whispering to someone. Not just someone. The house elf was talking back to the wizard, his tone soothing. The wizard looked back towards him before gazing down at the dash. "I have it, Kreacher." The wizard held up what looked like a large brooch for the elf's approval and the house elf's eyes shone in wonder. Cecilia stared. Just when she had been busy deducing that this wizard was serious, he had, in one act, shown himself to be his brother. There is one more for him to find. The light from the candles overhead reflected off the facets of the brooch and the elf looked at it hypnotically. He will search. But he will never find it. Regulus Black got to his feet and held the brooch, containing what Cecilia could only deduce contained the lost Horcrux, out at arm's length. "Master?" The house elf's expression had changed from softly cajoling to one of fear. He waited for Regulus Black to do or say something and the wizard conveniently obliged. He withdrew his wand and pointed it towards the brooch. This was it. The Horcrux. It had to be destroyed. She had to get hold of it to remove it from the memory. And by the look of it she would have to act fast as Regulus was about to cast a spell upon it. "Regulus," she whispered, hoping in this memory she could talk to Sirius's brother, perhaps persuade him to hand over the Horcrux to her. "Regulus." Cecilia whispered louder. But it seemed that neither the house elf nor the wizard had heard her. "Boo. Blood into a vial. Power in the blood. Do you know what this contains, Kreacher?" The terrified elf shook his head rapidly, holding onto his filthy pillowcase shoulder straps before wringing his hands anxiously. "This Horcrux contains the blood of the most wizardly wizard from the line back to the first wizard. It also contains the soul of Lord Voldemort. Oh, I so wish that my brother were here to see me do this. And now, Kreacher, I am going to put it beyond his reach." Regulus raised his wand again, and the scream that Cecilia gave would surely have alerted the players in this memory if it was going to. Instead she threw herself forward, in between the spell and the brooch. Out of the wizard's hand the brooch flipped as Cecilia knocked it out of his hand, the jewelry piece clattering onto the parquet floor. Before either the wizard or the elf could retrieve it, Cecilia took the brooch, cramming it into her pocket before jumping for the ascending tendril. She just made it, and painfully dragged herself higher as Regulus Black and Kreacher searched on the floor of number 12 for the brooch that had just been there. Cecilia hugged the tendril gratefully as she allowed it to pull her up. For a few moments she hugged it, letting the reality of the situation rest in her mind while, at the same time, she tried to work out how she should get back to the veil and into the room from which she had gone behind it. She looked down, and saw what looked like her original rope. No tendrils now sprung from memories. Clearly in some way the memories knew she had been successful in her quest. The only way to reach it then was to use the memories and hope they were dense enough to bear her as she sought the rope. And shoulders aching and burning in their sockets she trod tentatively on a passing memory cloud. 88,888,888. "Come on, Harry." Hermione's shriek brought attention to the fact that his friends, Fred and George, and Neville and Luna, were frantically beckoning him towards the antechamber. Ducking under a few spells he ran towards them, to be greeted with arms on his biceps as they pulled him out of the way of the battle that was going on. It didn't look good. Only about half of the Order remained now and only one of the original Aurors who Umbridge had summoned to capture them. Not that there was much now for them to defend. The chamber, archway and artifacts seemed to resemble ancient Greece or Rome, with the ravages of war causing the damage on the former that the ravages of time had caused on the latter. The Death Eaters had long run out of guns and other mole weapons, but this didn't matter. On the appearance of their lord, the Death Eaters reverted to their weapons of choice, wizard wands. Behind a large sarcophagus in the antechamber the children stood, huddled together as horrific battle raged before them. "This is rough," commented Neville, shaking his head sadly. "I hate to say it, but we're going down." "Sirius isn't on their side then?" asked Ron, bemused. "No, Ron," replied Hermione with uncharacteristic patience. "He just made believe to them that he was." Harry looked out onto the scene and his mind drifted to the potion. He had both the base and the mac to take, and he knew that if he was to actually do any good, regardless of whether Mrs. Frobisher was successful, he would have to take both potions and challenge Lord Voldemort. "Do you think Dumbledore knew about this?" Harry looked at Fred and George, the only two Order members there. At this late stage it didn't matter, surely, whether they told him. "Yes," nodded George. "And no," added Fred. Clearly they subscribed to this idea of information sharing, too. "There were to be sacrifices," continued George. "For the greater good," clarified Fred. "For the greater good." Those were the words that he knew Remus Lupin had spoken to Sirius when he had attacked Cecilia with the Veritaserum Maul those months ago, and what Dumbledore had mentioned when he had discussed with him about taking the potion and what the prophecies meant. He looked at the scene. So, in the words of Mrs. Frobisher, the Ministrieres and some of the Order are Coventry, and Voldemort's Death Eaters are the Luftwaffe. Ron's comment provoked a spark Harry's memory banks, and he recalled a Mole Studies lesson. The Mole Prime Minister had known that, during the Second World War, the city was a target for the Germans, but, if it was warned the citizens of Coventry to evacuate, an even bigger prize, interpretation of vital covert communications, would be lost. And so, probably, would the war have been. Coventry. Dumbledore could have come to them sooner, Harry thought. So what was the bigger prize? He watched as Snape turned to fight another Death Eater from the dozens that had poured into the chamber, before engaging another two who had turned unexpectedly and seen their ex-compatriot. Harry. But the prize was the defeat of Voldemort. So he was the Normandy landings. Harry. He turned to look at his friends. Their faces were filled with worry and fear, and he tried to smile as best as he could in order to calm them. Then, he reached into the pocket into which he had stowed the potions, gesturing for his best friend to hold out his palm. Picking up the base, Harry knocked it straight back, trying not to gag on the foul contents. His second, the match, was altogether much more palatable, and while still vile, he managed not to spray it all over his watchful friends. "Here goes," he said, withdrawing his wand. "Wish me luck." "We wish you to take care," whispered Hermione, who hugged him tightly, the tears in her eyes erupting quietly as she stepped away. Fred and George gave him a hearty, and vigorous, thump on the back before Harry looked at Neville, who shook his hand. "Go for it, Harry," he said, dropping his hand almost as soon as he had taken it. The hand in his grasp was almost immediately replaced by that of Luna, who also shook his hand and told him to watch out for the Snorkax. Then he turned to Ron. His friend stood there, a paradigm of calmness and composure, but Harry knew different. He knew if it had been Ron and he were the one saying goodbye, probably for the last time, he would have tailored his demeanor in a similar way. "See you, Ron," he said, taking a few steps back. It was cruel, he knew, not to leave his friend with anything more intimate, but he hoped that Ron would, in time, realize that he had done it to spare his feelings. "He's done it." Ron turned to Neville, who had voiced the accurately observed scene. "It seems so." Fred and George's unison was the only thing that echoed in the ears of the young witches and wizards, and each looked out onto the scene, where Harry was approaching Snape and Sirius, who were back to back, fighting 4 Death Eaters between them. "Shall we join them?" Rather than reply, each of the children looked at one another before withdrawing their wands defensively and striding after Harry. "You knew, didn't you?" Harry heard his godfather shout these words to Snape as he passed by them, seeking a bolt hole while he crept up on Voldemort, who was engaged in violent combat with Dumbledore. Snape said nothing. He didn't need to. He was probably the best person to know Sirius because of their hostile past. It was typical of the wizard to take his friend's side, and it was typical for him to revert to his roots. Sirius had acted on principle in an honest way like Snape would have acted through cold logic and reason. "But you didn't know about Cecilia? And Sirius knew him too, and how to torment him. You loved her?" Here was the knife, metaphorically speaking. "After a fashion," conceded Snape as he ducked a curse from one of the Death Eaters. "Appreciative love. Closeness, Sirius. So this is it then? We have to trust in her." Snape's voice was cold and plain with no edge of comfort in it. Not that Sirius expected it, but he had hoped for a time. "It's all my fault, Severus. I should have been down there." "You did what you thought was right, Black." He ducked and blocked the flash above his head. "In the same way that you did when you brought back Petunia Evans. From your brother's clutches." "How did you know about that?" Sirius sounded genuinely shocked as Snape revealed knowledge of a secret buried deep down and long ago. "She went with him voluntarily. She'd known him for about 6 months. Sirius's mouth fell open and he was nearly caught by a bolt from one of his Death Eaters. She was expecting Regulus's child. She was what? A couple of bolts himself and the other of his Death Eaters were down and he risked turning his head towards Snape. The wizard's face was impassive and he looked past Sirius at the immediate threat that was facing him. "It's not only you who makes mistakes," Sirius heard Snape say as he fended off a volley of sparks. "Regulus was the king of making mistakes," he exclaimed. "I was talking about myself. It takes a special person to see where help lies, even when it is packaged in a questionable form." Knocking down his second Death Eater, Sirius turned. The look on his face was one of horror. Over his shoulder Snape deflected a bolt. "Despite your best efforts, Sirius, I managed to turn my heart towards another. It was not to be. Just watch it," he added, deflecting another as one of the Carrows saw that Sirius was undefended. "I was happy enough to offer her my friendship when she needed me and I was grateful that she returned the gesture." Returned the gesture? At a time when I felt my will was low, and my allegiance to Dumbledore had waned. Sirius shook his head so as to consider the information Snape was giving him. A childish jelly-legs ginks surprised Amicus Carrow, leaving Sirius in a position to finish her off. "And I treated her so?" They wheeled around, still back to back, defending a corner of the room where the Weasley twins were dueling with a pair of Death Eaters. "Like you always treat people you don't understand. I'm heartened that you recognize your failing, Black. It is from here change can spring, thanks." He ducked as Sirius blasted a Death Eater to Snape's left. Petunia Evans was expecting Regulus's child. He was so much younger than her. 16, said Snape. And she had come all the way to Hogwarts for her sister. "But the child's dead though?" "Why do you say that?" Behind them a figure crossed across the back of the archway. Tabitha had been almost completely shielded from the battle that was now in full swing, which had given her a chance to consider a plan of action. She looked up into the eyes of her friend, who stooped down to her level and took her hand. "Van. Tabitha. How are you?" "Fine." She got to her knees and he pulled out by the elbow. Around her the casualties of war lay, in various states of injury ranging from stunned to dead, and there was not much to tell between them. Tabitha shook her head before looking imploringly at her friend and colleague. If anyone would understand it would be Vincento. "Van. Come on. We have to do something. Her shrill shriek was winded out of her as Vincento, the mysterious, gripped her elbow and pushed her down, standing again over Tabitha. He needed me for the mystery, said Vincento, his voice matter-of-fact and distant. How do you think I got them here? Tabitha watched in horror as Vincento stood over her, his wand pointed towards her face. Then he followed her eyes. Hermione Granger was standing next to him. Move. Hermione demanded. Now. But Vincento did not move. Instead, the bolt that Tabitha was to have received hit Hermione full in the chest, sending her careering backwards, hitting the stone wall of the chamber. Expelliarmus! Screamed Ron, pushing a Death Eater out of the way, and he hurried to Hermione's side before pointing it at the Mysteria. I will. Do not. I don't need to. Ron's voice was one of triumph, and he stabbed his wand in the direction of Harry, who was now, with Dumbledore, engaging Voldemort. But Vincento didn't turn. Instead he narrowed his eyes. Expelliarmus! Immobilis! Ron had the presence of mind to hit the floor as a volley of spell fire rebounded off the wall, disarming and immobilizing a Death Eater. Then Ron aimed a spell at Vincento, who was now fighting him. But it wasn't happening fast enough. Tabitha looked in the direction of the veil. She needed help. With as much strength as she could muster, Tabitha ran towards the veil. No one understood this artifact like her. No one was as good. As she approached, she heard a cackle behind her, but Tabitha ignored it and, stooping low, caught hold of the anchor rope on which the mole Cecilia Frobisher would ascend. But the cackling continued, and all at once Bellatrix Lestrange and Narcissa Malfoy stood over the Mysteria like malevolent vultures as she reached for the rope. Tabitha Penright ignored them and instead looked past them and at the battle which was now taking place between Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort upon the field of devastation which the chamber had become. Before either of the witches could say and do anything, however, a crack of green light like a flash of a camera illuminated the scene. All those who were fighting stopped and gaped at the scene. That sounded like the Avada Kedavra curse, thought Tabitha grimly as she focused her mind on the rope and the mole who should now have been ascending up it. Behind her, running feet and shrieks echoed around the now still chamber. Instead of looking round, Tabitha was fixed on the veil, willing with her extraordinary power that Cecilia Frobisher would emerge soon, and she leaned further over the edge of the archway. If she had cared to have looked, however, Tabitha would have seen what everyone else was seeing, Voldemort standing over the body of Harry Potter. 88,888,888. Cecilia was no longer climbing through the cloud memories. She had been careful to select memories which were larger. From experience, Cecilia knew they were denser because they contained more substance. By following this rule of thumb, she had managed to reach the rope, which automatically began to descend as she held onto it. Down was not the way she needed to go, but it didn't seem to matter because the light above her, which Cecilia had presumed was the exit back to the chamber, was coming towards her. She didn't care. Cecilia had what she needed, the brooch from Regulus which contained the Horcrux. Nothing else mattered. She closed her eyes, and then opened them when she realized the rope was now being hauled towards the light, which was rapidly now becoming quicker. Hello. What have you caught there, Puss? A stunning specimen, if I'm humbly to judge. It took a few moments for the faces of those surrounding her to sink in. She recognized them all, though never in her robes. The man called Puss helped her onto the dark, hard floor next to the archway, and, as he did so, a voice of alarm caused Cecilia to shake, her scream muffled by the closing of her throat. The man who stood there, who had addressed the first wizard as Puss, was someone she certainly did recognize. The voice belonged to Lucius Malfoy,